Welcome to the deep dive. Sometimes the world just feels, oh, well, impossibly tangled, especially when you're trying to make sense of international conflict.
It really does.
We get flooded with headlines, don't we? Wars, civil unrest, these constantly shifting global power dynamics. And honestly, it's really tough to grasp the true underlying forces at play. What's really driving events beneath all that surface
It
noise?
absolutely is. And it's so easy to feel overwhelmed just by the sheer volume of information, never mind the complexity.
Hmm.
So our mission with this deep dive, really, is to try and cut through some of that complexity for you. We're going to take what might seem like completely separate ideas, different threads, and try to connect them.
Weaving them together.
Exactly.
Huh?
And in doing that, reveal some, I think, surprising and pretty powerful insights into why conflicts ignite in the first place, why they escalate, and how they sometimes spread.
And we'll challenge some common assumptions along the way, maybe offer a much more nuanced understanding. And it's all drawn directly from this fascinating stack of research papers you've shared with us.
That's the plan. Really get into the research.
That's right. So get ready to look at global conflict maybe a bit differently, because today we're exploring, well, what truly defines a rogue state. Hint, it might not be what you think. Then, how ethnicity profoundly shapes civil wars. And the often misunderstood role of culture in security studies its limitations, sure, but also its profound contributions.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one.
Definitely. We'll also try to uncover the hidden influence of religion, specifically on conflict severity, and trace the far-reaching ripple effect of refugee movements across borders.
Lots to unpack there.
Absolutely. This is going to be a journey filled with, I think, some truly eye-opening moments, some real aha moments, hopefully. Okay, let's kick things off with a concept that's been, well, a real cornerstone of foreign policy for decades now, the rogue state.
Familiar term.
Right. When we hear that term, especially, in U.S. foreign policy discourse since the Cold War ended, a very specific image typically pops into mind, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Traditionally, yeah, a rogue state has been characterized by its external actions, countries violating international norms.
Like what specifically?
Well, typically sponsoring terrorism or illicitly pursuing banned weapons, especially weapons of mass destruction, WMDs.
Right. The big scary stuff.
Exactly. The focus has almost exclusively been on the outward threat they pose.
Yeah.
The threat to international peace and security.
And, on the surface, that makes perfect sense, right? If a state is developing nukes or funding terror groups, that feels like a direct, undeniable threat to other nations, to the whole global order.
Logically, yes.
But here's where the research takes a really fascinating turn. Our first kind of surprising finding comes from a study by Mary Caprioli and Peter F. Trumbore back in 2005. They actually uncovered something quite counterintuitive.
Yeah, this is where it gets interesting. What's truly striking is that these traditional rogue states, the ones specifically identified by policymakers for those external threats, like supporting terrorism or seeking banned weapons.
The usual suspects.
The usual suspects, exactly. They actually don't show any significant difference in their international conflict behavior compared to other states.
Wait, really? No difference.
Statistically speaking, no significant difference in how often they get into conflicts. This was a direct challenge to the prevailing wisdom at the time. It basically means that focusing only on those outward actions might be missing the real story, missing what actually drives international aggression.
That is a huge finding. Wow. Okay, so if it's not these traditional external behaviors that define a state as rogue in terms of, its conflict proneness,
Right.
then what is it?
Well, this is where Caprioli and Trumbore proposed an alternative understanding.
Yeah.
One that, as they put it, actually harks back to earlier notions of international pariah states.
Pariah states. Okay, so going back a bit.
Yeah, suggesting we fundamentally shift our perspective, look inward rather than just outward.
How so?
Precisely. The core idea they put forward is this. What if true rogue status isn't primarily about external threats, the missiles and terror, but about how a state treats its own citizens?
Ah, okay. Internal behavior driving external behavior.
Kind of. The concept builds on insights from theories like structural violence.
Yeah.
The idea that violence isn't just, physical acts, but it's embedded in social structures.
Built into the system itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it also draws on feminist theory, which suggests that violence at all levels of human society, whether it's domestic violence, structural inequality, or physical conflict, it's all sort of interconnected.
Okay. That's a powerful idea.
It is. And the argument is that the same violent norms that manifest internally.
Through repression, discrimination.
Exactly, through how a state treats its own population.
Mhm.
Those same norms can logically drive its external behavior on the international stage.
So it spills over.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
And this alternative definition they propose specifically focuses on recognized international human rights norms. Things like non-discrimination, security of the person,
Mhm.
rights enshrined in fundamental documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
So it's about crossing those lines.
It's about a state placing itself beyond the recognized boundaries of international society through its egregious treatment of its own people.
That's a really powerful reframing. Okay, so how did they actually go about measuring this human rights rogue status? It sounds complex.
Well, they developed what they called a Rogue State Index, the RSI, for the period between 1980 and 2001. And it focused on three specific domestic characteristics.
Okay, what were they?
Right, so the first characteristic was ethnic discrimination. They looked at states where minorities at risk, that's from a specific data set, the MAR data set, suffered systematic economic or political discrimination compared to other domestic groups.
So actual policies or just neglect?
It could be both. States formally excluding certain groups from political or economic life, or maybe failing to address inherent violence embedded in their social structures that disadvantages certain groups.
Got it. What was the second?
The second was gender discrimination. This was measured by the percentage of women in the national legislature using data from the Interparliamentary Union.
Why legislature representation specifically?
What the rationale, drawing partly on UN suggestions, is
Yeah.
that you need a certain threshold, maybe around 30% representation, for women to effectively influence decisions. So lower percentages were seen as indicators of broader societal disadvantages for women, impacting their access to education, professional jobs, healthcare, childcare, you name it.
Okay, makes sense. And the third component, this sounds like it gets into more direct state violence.
It does. The third component really zeroes in on outright repression, focusing specifically on violations of personal integrity rights.
What does that mean in practice?
This was measured using something called the Political Terror Scale, or PTS data. It focuses on really egregious violations, things like political imprisonment, torture, state-sponsored political killings, or disappearances.
So, serious stuff. How did they combine these?
Right, a state received a score of 3 or higher on this scale if it exhibited extensive political imprisonment, systematic brutality, frequent executions, or unlimited detention just for political views. But here's the crucial part. A state was coded as a human rights rogue only if it exhibited all 3 of these behaviors, ethnic discrimination, gender discrimination, and severe repression simultaneously in a given year.
All three together.
All 3 together. It wasn't about isolated incidents, you see. It was about the cumulative effect, this pattern of systematic discrimination and repression across different dimensions.
Okay, so they developed this comprehensive new index, this RSI. What did the research actually find when they put it to the test? This is where the implications for global security really hit home, right?
Absolutely. The results were quite powerful. Striking, really. Human rights rogues, defined this way, were found to be 50% more likely to get into any kind of armed dispute with another state, what researchers call a militarized interstate dispute, or MID annually.
50% more likely. That's significant.
Very. And even more strikingly, they were more than twice as likely, 2.3 times, to be precise, to become involved in violent interstate disputes each year, the ones involving actual use of force.
Wow. Twice as likely for violent ones.
Yeah. And consider this statistic. While these human rights rogues constituted only about 1/3 of all states in any given year during their study period, 1980 to 2001,
Okay.
they accounted for a staggering 60% of all violent conflicts during that time.
60% from just a third of the states.
60%. And furthermore, their prior research had already shown that once involved in a dispute, these human rights rogues were more likely to be the first to use force. They were more likely to escalate.
That is genuinely a groundbreaking finding. It really turns the traditional focus on its head. And you mentioned it's not just a proxy for democracy versus authoritarianism either, right? Because we often assume democracies are peaceful, authoritarian states are aggressive, but this seems to go deeper.
It does seem to. The Rogue State Index, the RSI, is not simply a stand-in for a state's regime type like democracy or autocracy.
How did they check that?
Well, the study found that regime type only accounted for a small fraction, about 12% of the variance in a state's RSI score. And in their statistical models, traditional regime type variables were often insignificant. statistically speaking, unlike the RSI, which consistently showed strong statistical significance in predicting conflict involvement.
So being a democracy or not wasn't the main driver here.
It highlights that while democracies are indeed less likely to be human rights rogues in the first place, simply labeling a state as democratic or authoritarian doesn't fully capture these underlying norms of violence that, according to this research, seem to drive international belligerence. It's more about the nature of the state's internal governance, its respect for human dignity across these different dimensions, regardless of its nominal political structure.
Okay, so stepping back, what does this all mean for policymakers, for how we think about international security? It seems like it completely shifts the focus away from purely external indicators.
It really should make us reconsider, shouldn't it? Instead of just tracking missile programs or terrorist financing, which are obviously still important concerns,
Sure, of course.
this research strongly suggests we should be scrutinizing a state's internal human rights record far more closely, maybe seeing it as a leading indicator of potential external aggression.
It truly does suggest that focusing solely on external threats from rogue states, as traditionally defined, might be missing a huge piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. The research makes a really compelling case that serial human rights abusers, through their systemic internal violence and repression against their own citizens, pose a demonstrable and quantifiable threat to international peace and stability.
So, for policymakers looking to promote global security,
Well, paying close attention to human rights within states might actually be a more effective strategy, or at least a crucial complementary strategy compared to the narrower focus we've often seen in the past. It means that the way a state treats its own population isn't just an internal matter, it's a crucial, perhaps often overlooked, indicator of its potential for aggression on the international stage.
okay, so from how states treat their citizens and potentially project that outward, let's shift our gaze inward again, but this time to another incredibly pervasive and often devastating aspect of global conflict: civil wars, and specifically the profound role that ethnicity plays. When you look at the numbers, the picture is pretty stark, isn't it?
It truly is. It's quite sobering. Denny and Walter's 2014 research presents this striking statistic. Since 1946, so basically the post-World War II era, a remarkable 64% of all civil wars have divided along ethnic lines.
64%. Wow. That's almost two-thirds.
It is. And importantly, this isn't just about the headline-grabbing secessionist movements, groups trying to break away and form their own state.
Right, not just those.
Even if you remove those from the equation, almost half, 45% of all civil wars fought for control of the central government are started by ethnically distinct rebel groups.
So even when they're fighting over who runs the existing country, ethnicity is still central almost half the time.
Exactly. And it also bears noting, their research highlights that ethnic civil wars also tend to last longer. They're more protracted.
Which suggests deeper underlying challenges to resolution, to peace.
That seems to be the case, yeah.
Okay, that's a huge percentage, a huge impact. So why? Why is ethnicity such a powerful, seemingly enduring force in these conflicts? Denny and Walter, building on a lot of existing literature, they organize the drivers of ethnic civil war into three interconnected categories, right? Grievances, opportunity, and bargaining failure.
That's the framework, yes.
Yeah.
A really useful way to think about it.
Let's start with grievances. The why. Why do ethnic groups often feel so aggrieved? What are the roots of that?
Right. Grievances are the motive, aren't they? The deep dissatisfaction that creates the spark, the initial reason to potentially rebel. And these can stem from a whole variety of forms of discrimination.
Like what kind of things?
Well, historically, you might see how past colonial policies maybe entrenched divisions or favored one group over another, or, more currently, you might have ethnically biased policies instituted by a dominant group specifically to maintain power.
So active discrimination.
Active discrimination, yeah.
Yeah.
This can manifest as blatant political exclusion, making it basically impossible for other groups to compete fairly for power. Or it could be through strong nationalist rhetoric that becomes inherently linked to a ruling ethnicity, marginalizing others.
And economically, too.
Absolutely. Economic discrimination is huge, where resources, government spending, jobs are disproportionately directed to one group, leading to really unequal development and opportunities. And then there's cultural or social discrimination, things like outlawing a minority's language, suppressing their traditions, disrespecting their identity.
And it's rarely just one of these things in isolation, is it? It often feels like a cumulative, crushing effect over time.
Exactly right. It's often a combination. These different forms of discrimination frequently lead to poverty, hardship, and just deep-seated resentment within the excluded group. When you feel systematically disadvantaged, excluded, and disrespected, the motive to fight for change, maybe violently, becomes incredibly powerful.
That makes sense. The injustice itself becomes a potent catalyst.
A potent catalyst, yes. And we should also mention, they note how large-scale migration patterns can sometimes lead to conflicts with other ethnic groups, maybe creating further grievances or exacerbating existing tensions over land or resources. So it's complex, but the core is that feeling of being wronged as a group.
Okay, so that's the motive, grievances. But as you said, grievances alone aren't usually enough to start a war. Most aggrieved individuals, most aggrieved groups even, never actually rebel.
That's right. It's a huge step to take up arms.
So this brings us to the second pillar in their framework, opportunity. Why are ethnic groups often, seemingly, better positioned to mobilize for rebellion compared to, say, purely ideological or class-based groups?
This is where ethnic identity provides some unique advantages for organizing resistance. Think about what rebellion requires. Immense coordination, finding ways to evade government repression, and mobilizing enough people willing to risk their lives as soldiers.
Not easy task.
Not at all. And ethnic groups often benefit from having a common language, a shared culture, pre-existing social networks. These things naturally facilitate communication and the spread of information. It makes it easier for potential leaders to gauge support, identify reliable recruits, especially if the group is geographically concentrated where these networks are dense.
So the infrastructure for organizing is kind of already there?
In many ways, yes. Plus, these shared ethnic ties often act as a strong incentive for loyalty. There's a built-in trust, perhaps, and mechanisms to ensure that promised benefits of rebellion are indeed shared among the group, and that members are accountable.
And what about hiding? Evading capture must be easier, too, if you're embedded in a community that identifies with you, speaks your language, and is maybe willing to protect you.
Absolutely crucial. Ethnic enclaves, particularly if they're in peripheral regions or difficult terrain, can provide critical safe havens. Co-ethnics are often less likely to betray their leaders to the authorities, partly out of loyalty, but also sometimes due to the group's ability to effectively punish traitors within the community.
Right. And then there's the money. Rebellions need funding. How does ethnicity help there?
Another key advantage. Geographic concentration can allow greater access to and control over local resources, maybe natural resources like diamonds or timber, or agricultural products that can be taxed or sold. Proximity to international borders can also facilitate smuggling or other criminal activities to raise funds. But perhaps most significantly, ethnic groups often benefit immensely from the support of large diaspora communities living in wealthier countries. Think of groups in the US, Canada, Europe, Australia. These diasporas often provide crucial financial backing, political lobbying, sometimes even weapons.
That's a huge external resource.
It's a powerful and often unique advantage that many non-ethnic movements just don't have access to in the same way.
Okay, so we have the motives, the grievances, and we have the means, the opportunity facilitated by ethnic ties. The third pillar helps explain something you mentioned earlier. Why these ethnic civil wars, once they start, tend to be so difficult to end, they last longer. Why is that?
It comes down to bargaining problems.
Exactly, bargaining failure.
If war is inherently costly for everyone involved, lives lost, resources destroyed, why can't rational actors just negotiate a settlement and avoid all that bloodshed? Why is peace so elusive, specifically in ethnic conflicts? This is where commitment issues become absolutely central, according to the research. Negotiated power-sharing deals, which are often the basis for peace settlements, are notoriously difficult to make credibly stick in ethnic conflicts.
Why is that?
Primarily because ethnic identities are relatively fixed. They don't change easily. And demographic trends, like birth rates between different groups, can often be predicted with some accuracy.
Okay, so you can see the future balance shifting.
Exactly. So imagine one ethnic group has a significantly higher birth rate. They might anticipate gaining demographic and thus political strength over time. The side that expects to be stronger in the future has very little incentive to honor an original peace agreement that might lock them into a weaker position later on.
They're thinking long term.
They can effectively look down the road, as the researchers say, anticipate these future power imbalances, and become unwilling to settle for a deal today when they're relatively strong, because they fear that deal won't hold tomorrow when the balance shifts. They don't trust the other side to uphold it if they become weaker.
A fundamental trust issue based on identity and demographics.
Precisely. And public rejection of proposed peace terms can also play a big role, especially if those terms are seen to affect a group's future voting power, cultural standing, or control over territory. It's hard for leaders to sell a compromise that seems to disadvantage their group down the line.
It sounds like a built-in instability mechanism, almost designed to make long-term peace difficult. What about other bargaining problems, like information issues, where one side might not know the other's true strength or resolve? Does that play a big role here?
Interestingly, the research suggests that information problems tend to have less impact on the duration of ethnic conflicts. Governments generally have pretty good information about the ethnic groups within their borders, their size, location, potential capabilities. Yep. So pure information asymmetry isn't usually the primary driver for why ethnic civil wars last so incredibly long. However, a government might strategically misrepresent its willingness to fight, maybe to try and deter multiple potential ethnic challengers from rising up simultaneously. So information games could influence the onset of conflict. But the more fundamental challenge that prolongs these wars really seems to lie in those deep-seated commitment issues. The inability to trust that a deal made today under one power balance will actually hold tomorrow when that balance inevitably changes, especially when identities feel immutable.
And you add to that the fact that sometimes the issues at the very heart of the conflict just seem non-negotiable. Things like sacred land or historical territory or core elements of national identity.
Exactly. Those are often central to a group's ethnic identity, and they're frequently seen as indivisible.
You can't split the difference on sacred ground.
Precisely. How do you compromise on something that is considered inherently whole and absolutely fundamental to your group's existence or identity? It makes compromise extremely difficult, if not impossible in some cases, further cementing that bargaining problem and prolonging the conflict.
So when we put all this together, the grievances, the opportunity, the bargaining failures, what does it really tell us about ethnicity and conflict?
It tells us that ethnicity isn't just some superficial cultural label. It's a incredibly powerful organizing principle that can both fuel the start of civil wars and sustain them for tragically long periods.
Yeah, it creates this powerful, often tragic dynamic.
It really does, because you have these deep-seated grievances providing the motive. You have the unique mobilization advantages that ethnic groups often possess, providing the opportunity and means to organize. And then you have these inherent, difficult-to-overcome bargaining challenges, especially commitment problems tied to identity, that make lasting peace just incredibly elusive.
So understanding these three pillars, grievances, opportunity, bargaining, seems absolutely crucial to grasping why ethnic civil wars are so prevalent, so protracted, and frankly so devastating across the globe.
I think that's exactly right. It gives us a much clearer picture of the underlying mechanics.
Okay, moving on from the specific dynamics of ethnic conflict, let's talk about another concept that's frequently invoked, sometimes controversially, when we discuss international relations and security.
Culture.
Ah, yes, culture. Always a big topic.
It is. And in security studies, there's been this long-standing debate, hasn't there, between those who emphasize material factors, military power, economics, geography, the stuff realism focuses on, and those who emphasize culture.
That's the classic divide, realism versus, well, various forms of culturalism or constructivism.
Right. And Michael C. Desch's 1998 analysis, which we looked at, really helps us assess what he called the latest wave of cultural theories that were challenging or at least trying to supplement that dominant realist perspective.
Exactly. He frames it as an assessment. Realism, as you said, largely focuses on tangible material factors, military capabilities, geographical position, the raw balance of power between states. That's seen as the primary driver of state behavior.
Culturalists, on the other hand, emphasize ideational factors. Things like shared beliefs, values, norms, historical narratives, strategic preferences shaped by identity. Basically, the software rather than the hardware of statecraft.
Software versus hardware, I like that. So the central question Desch explores is, do these cultural theories really replace realist theories? Do they offer a better explanation? Or do they simply add to them, maybe filling in the gaps where realism is less precise?
That's the core of his inquiry. Where does culture fit in the explanatory hierarchy?
And it's worth noting that cultural theorizing itself is quite diverse. It's not just one monolithic thing, is it? Scholars look at how culture impacts security in lots of different ways.
Absolutely. Desch outlines several strands. There's organizational culture, which looks at how military's internal cultures, their doctrines, traditions, biases, affect how they actually fight. Think Legros on World War II navies.
Okay, the culture within the military.
Right. Then there's political culture, which examines how broader domestic political attitudes and norms influence things like civilian control over the military or the public's willingness to use force. Keir on France or Katzenstein and Berger on post-war Japan and Germany fit here.
So the wider society's view on the military.
Exactly. Then you have strategic culture, which is a bit different. It considers how a nation's unique, deeply ingrained strategic worldview shapes its overall grand strategy and approach to international relations. Johnston on Ming China is a key example there.
A national way of thinking about security.
Kind of, yes.
Yeah.
And finally, there's the idea of global culture or norms. This looks at how widely shared international norms and identities influence state behavior, things like the norm against chemical weapons or norms around humanitarian intervention or the nuclear taboo.
Okay, so it's a pretty broad church of ideas under the culture umbrella.
Definitely. Different levels, different mechanisms.
Now, this focus on culture isn't entirely new. Desh reminds us that it's not the first time cultural arguments have been prominent in security debates. There was quite a strong wave of culturalism during the Cold War, making some pretty bold predictions, many of which, looking back now, turned out to be, well, wrong.
Yes, that serves as a really important cautionary tale, doesn't it?
How so?
Yeah.
What were those Cold War arguments?
Well, during the Cold War, some culturalist arguments suggested, for instance, that the U.S. military's organizational culture was too scientific and accountant-like, too focused on metrics and systems analysis.
Too technocratic.
Exactly, making it supposedly inflexible and disadvantaged against the Clausewitzian Soviets, who were perceived as being more focused on decisive battle, willpower, and the political nature of war.
Interesting contrast.
And relatedly, there was also this idea floating around that the democratic U.S. political culture was inherently weak and indecisive, especially compared to what was seen as the highly cohesive authoritarian Soviet Union. The implication was that the Soviets had this built-in strategic edge because they could act decisively without messy public debate.
Right, the supposed efficiency of autocracy. But history, as we know, had other plans. Those predictions didn't really pan out, did they?
Not really, no. As Desh points out, these predictions turned out to be largely incorrect. The United States ultimately won the Cold War, however you define that. It performed exceptionally well, militarily speaking, in the Persian Gulf War. And even a perceived failure in Vietnam, according to many analyses, had arguably more to do with the sheer difficulty, the insurmountable task of nation-building, as Desh puts it, and perhaps the deficiencies of U.S. allies, rather than some fundamental American cultural shortcoming in waging war.
So the track record wasn't great for those Cold War cultural predictions.
It really wasn't. And it demonstrates the danger of over-relying on these kinds of broad cultural explanations to predict grand strategic outcomes, especially when they might seem to contradict the material realities of power.
Okay, so this historical context brings us to Desh's core argument about why culture cannot simply replace realism as the primary explanation for state behavior and security. He argues that many modern cultural theories often fail to provide what he calls crucial tests. They don't really put themselves head-to-head with realism in a way that clearly demonstrates their superiority.
That's his main methodological critique, yes.
Yeah.
They often don't pick hard cases for cultural theories, situations where realism would predict one thing and culture clearly predicts something different, allowing a clean test.
What does he mean by that? How do they fail that test?
Well, he observes that culturalists often choose most likely cases for their theories, situations where culture is expected to be a strong explanatory factor.
Yeah.
But the problem is, in many of these same cases, realists, looking at material factors, would also predict a similar outcome. So it doesn't really prove culture is more important.
Can you give an example?
Sure. He mentions Stephen Rosen's work arguing India's divided society undermined its military effectiveness. A culturalist might say, see, culture matters. But a realist wouldn't necessarily expect a non-central global player like India, facing its specific regional threats, to have the same kind of tightly integrated military structures as a great power locked in intense competition. The predictions overlap.
Okay. So the explanation isn't uniquely cultural. What about cases where the interpretation itself is disputable, like the French military doctrine before World War II? You mentioned Keir's work on that.
Right. That's a classic case often cited by culturalists. Elizabeth Keir linked France's defensive military doctrine in the 1930s to its domestic political culture and the Army's organizational culture.
Makes intuitive sense, perhaps.
It does, on the surface. However, realists push back strongly. They argue that France's shift to a defensive posture was actually a perfectly rational, material response to its dramatic decline relative to Germany, between the wars in population, industrial potential, military capability. France was simply weaker and knew it.
So defense was the logical option given the power balance.
Arguably, yes. And France's ultimate defeat in 1940, Desch argues following others, was likely more about a specific strategic blunder, the failure to anticipate the German armored thrust through the Ardennes forest, a mistake that even non-French military experts made, rather than solely a deep-seated cultural failing preventing adaptation. It shows how material conditions and specific strategic choices can be very powerful, often primary drivers, even if culture shapes some of the details or implementation.
What about norms, like the taboo against chemical weapons? Culturalists often point to that as a success story for norms over pure military utility.
That's another key example. Desch tackles. Richard Price and Nina Cannonwald powerfully argued that the non-use of chemical weapons in major conflicts after World War I was largely due to the development of a strong international norm, a taboo, viewing them as illegitimate.
And Desch disagrees.
He offers a more realpolitik counterargument. He suggests that mutual deterrence, the fear that if you use them, the enemy will use them back, and crucially, their often lack of decisive military utility are more convincing explanations for non-use in many cases.
Lack of utility. How so?
Well, chemical weapons are often most effective against unprepared or unprotected adversaries. Against well-equipped, trained forces with protective gear and countermeasures, their battlefield impact can be limited. They're difficult to use effectively on offense, especially in mobile warfare, and relatively easy to defend against if you're prepared.
Okay.
So Desch points to cases like Iraq using chemical weapons against Iranians and Kurds who lacked effective retaliation capabilities.
But not against the U.S.-led coalition in the Gulf War.
Exactly, because the U.S. did have massive retaliation capabilities. This pattern, he argues, supports the deterrence and utility argument more strongly than a purely normative one. The norm might exist, but deterrence and practical considerations likely played a bigger role in decisions about use.
Okay, so if culture often fails these hard tests or offers disputable interpretations, what is its value? If it can't replace realism, where does it fit in our understanding of conflict and security?
This is where Desch offers a more constructive conclusion. Cultural theories become truly valuable, he argues, when realism is indeterminate, when the material balance of power or the structure of the international system doesn't give us a clear prediction.
Filling in the gaps, basically.
Exactly. Culture can help explain the why behind certain puzzles. For instance, it can explain why states sometimes lag in adapting to clear structural changes in the international system. Their old strategic culture or organizational habits might persist even when the environment demands change.
Inertia, yeah.
Or, perhaps more interestingly, why some states seem to act contrary to what seem like clear structural imperatives. He mentions Kenneth Pollock's work, suggesting that certain aspects of Arab political and military culture consistently undermined their ability to successfully conduct modern armored warfare, leading to repeated losses against Israel, even when they had comparable equipment. That's not easily explained by realism's core assumptions about states learning and emulating success.
So it explains deviations or suboptimal behavior.
Potentially, yes. And Desch suggests culture is likely most relevant, has the greatest independent explanatory power in what he calls structurally indeterminate environments.
What does that mean?
Situations where a state faces neither clear, overwhelming external threats nor clear, overwhelming internal threats, or perhaps it faces both simultaneously. In these complex, ambiguous situations, the international structure might not strongly dictate one specific course of action. There might be multiple rational paths. And that's where domestic factors like political culture, strategic culture, or organizational biases can really come to the fore and shape the choices leaders make.
When there's more room for maneuver, culture steers the ship.
That's a good way to put it. So the big takeaway here isn't that culture is irrelevant. Far from it. But it's probably not a replacement for realism's focus on power and structure. Instead, it offers crucial insights into the why and how of state behavior, especially explaining variations, lags, and choices made when material forces alone don't provide the full picture. It's a valuable supplement, a vital lens that enriches our understanding by illuminating the ideational underpinnings, the beliefs and values that influence how states navigate the international arena.
All right, let's delve into another profound and often intensely debated force that shapes global events: religion. Since the end of the Cold War particularly, we've seen what many call a noticeable religious resurgence on the global stage. It seems to be influencing everything from human rights movements to, unfortunately, the discourse around terrorism.
Absolutely. It's undeniable that religion has become a much more visible and politically salient force internationally in recent decades.
And this visibility led to some big predictions, right? Like Samuel Huntington's famous or infamous, depending on your view, Clash of Civilizations thesis back in 1996. He predicted that religion, or rather civilizational identity, often defined by religion, would be a primary driver of interstate disputes in the post-Cold War era.
He did. And that sparked a huge debate, which is still ongoing in many ways. Many scholars push back, questioning whether religion truly causes international conflict in a fundamental way, or if it's often just a superficial layer, a justification or a tool used to mask deeper geopolitical or economic interests.
Is it the cause or just the label? Question.
Exactly. It's a tough knot to untangle.
This is where Peter Eshen's 2012 research, which we examine, offers a really helpful, nuanced argument. He tries to move beyond simply debating if religion matters to exploring the specific conditions under which it influences conflict. It's not a yes-no question for him.
That's the key shift in his approach. Not if, but when and how. What did he uncover about the actual mechanisms? How does religion influence conflict dynamics beyond that basic question whether it matters at all?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting and, frankly, quite surprising based on common assumptions. Hen's work, looking at the data, clearly shows that religion does not significantly affect the onset of interstate disputes.
So it doesn't make wars start more often?
Apparently not, according to his findings. States typically initiate conflicts based on calculations of security interests, territorial disputes, miscalculations, power politics, the usual suspects. Not primarily because of religious beliefs per se.
Okay, that's a major finding in itself.
Yep. It is. But here's the twist. Once a dispute begins, for whatever reason, that's when domestic factors become much more critical. Leaders suddenly become deeply concerned about maintaining domestic support, rallying the population, justifying the costs. And this is precisely where religious pressure can come into play, influencing the severity of the dispute and their willingness to escalate rather than back down.
So religion acts more as an accelerant, maybe,
Hmm.
or something that makes de-escalation harder rather than being the initial spark.
That seems to be the core argument. It's not necessarily a trigger, but it can definitely fuel the fire once it's lit.
Okay, that's a crucial distinction. So what are the specific conditions Hen identified for when religion's influence on severity becomes significant? It's not in every conflict involving religious states, right?
No, he identifies two key conditions that need to be present. First, there must be close religion-state connections within at least one of the states involved.
What does that mean, practically?
These are formal or informal institutional ties between religious groups and the state apparatus. These ties grant religious groups leverage over political leaders, making religious beliefs and the concerns of religious actors more central to that country's politics. Think of states with an official religion, or states where religious law has a formal role, or even states where government policies actively restrict or regulate religious practice, paradoxically giving certain religious actors more political influence and opposition.
Okay, so the religion needs to be institutionally embedded in politics. What's the second condition?
The second condition is international ideological distance between the disputing parties, specifically along religious lines. Hen found that the most intense religious influence on conflict severity occurs when one state is religious, meaning it has those strong religion-state connections we just discussed, and the other state is perceived as secular, lacking such strong institutional ties between religion and state.
So it's the contrast that matters most, religious versus secular.
Precisely. It's that significant ideological divide between them that seems to really activate the religious dynamic in a conflict.
Okay, so it's not just about a country being religious in its population, but specifically how that religion is connected to the state and the ideological gap with its opponent. How does this ideological distance then actually exacerbate disputes once they begin? What's the mechanism?
Henner proposes a couple of mechanisms. When a state with strong religion-state connections faces a perceived secular state in a dispute, the religious regime often experiences heightened threat perceptions. They might see the conflict not just as a geopolitical dispute, but as an ideological assault on their values or way of life.
Okay, a sense of being under attack ideologically.
Right. But perhaps more crucially, leaders in that religious state may fear that backing down or compromising in a dispute with a secular state could profoundly undermine their domestic legitimacy and support, especially from the more religious elements within their own society who might see compromise as a betrayal of faith or national identity.
The domestic audience problem. Leaders worry about looking weak to their religious base.
Exactly. There's also potentially a fear of ideological contagion. a concern that secular ideas or values from the opposing state could seep in and undermine their political power domestically. This might be particularly acute given what some see as a rising global divide between religious and secular worldviews.
So it really raises the stakes internally for the leaders of the religious state.
It seems to. Interestingly, Henn notes that in disputes between two religious states, even if they follow different religions, while religious issues might certainly be points of contention, losing the dispute might not carry the same profound threat to the regime's fundamental religious legitimacy at home. It's that stark ideological chasm with a perceived secular state that often seems to raise the internal political stakes for a religious regime, pushing them towards escalation rather than compromise.
That's a fascinating nuance. Okay, and what did his empirical findings actually show? He looked at data from 1990 to 2000, right? Do the numbers back up this theory about severity versus onset?
They did, quite clearly. The big reveal from his statistical analysis was that disputes involving these religious secular dyads, meaning one state with close religion-state connections and another identified as secular, were significantly more likely to involve the use of force. They were more severe than disputes that didn't have this particular dyadic makeup.
More likely to turn violent.
Yes. And, consistent with the theory, this effect did not extend to conflict initiation. Religion-state connections didn't make states more likely to start fights, only more likely to escalate them once started.
Okay. Any other interesting wrinkles in the findings?
Yeah, he also found some nuance regarding the specific religious makeup of the countries involved. While the primary factors seem to be that religion-state connection and the religious-secular ideological distance, disputes between religious secular dyads where the two states also had different majority religious makeups, for example, a religious Muslim state versus a secular Christian majority state, were even more likely to be severe.
Okay, difference amplified it.
But interestingly, and perhaps counterintuitively, disputes between two religious states that shared the same majority religious makeup, for example, two religious Muslim states, were actually less likely to involve force than other types of dyads.
Huh. Shared religion maybe provided some common ground or restraint.
Perhaps. The study didn't delve deeply into that specific findings mechanism, but it's suggestive. And crucially, the overall substantive impact of these religion-state connections and the religious-secular dynamic on dispute severity was found to be quite strong, comparable to, or even stronger than, the effect of having a territorial claim at stake, which political scientists often consider one of the most potent drivers of conflict escalation.
Wow. So this religious dimension is right up there with fighting over land in terms of making conflicts nastier.
That's what the data suggested for that period, yeah.
Can you give us some real-world illustrations, examples of this dynamic potentially at play where religion seemed to intensify a conflict that was already underway?
Sure. Henn offers a few plausible examples. Think about the brutal Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. While Iraq's initial invasion was largely geopolitically motivated by border disputes and Saddam Hussein's ambition.
Right, classic power politics.
Once the war began, Iran's revolutionary leaders very effectively leveraged the secular nature of the Iraqi Ba'athist regime to rally support through appeal to religious symbols, framing it as a defense of Islam. This religious framing arguably exacerbated the conflict immensely and prolonged its intensity well beyond what initial geopolitical calculations might have expected.
It became an existential religious struggle for Iran's side.
It certainly was portrayed that way. Another example Henn touches on is the First Gulf War. Saddam Hussein, despite having led a largely secular regime for years, strategically tried to frame his resistance to the U.S.-led coalition after invading Kuwait as a religious struggle, a jihad against foreign invaders, highlighting religious differences to try and garner domestic and broader Arab Muslim support.
Even though his initial invasion of Kuwait wasn't religiously motivated?
Right. The religious framing was added later, arguably to intensify the confrontation and make de-escalation more difficult by appealing to a different level of identity and grievance. And the enduring, bitter rivalry between India and Pakistan also arguably illustrates aspects of this. The historically close ties between religion and state identity in Pakistan have often led its leaders to frame conflicts and disputes with India, particularly over Kashmir, through potent religious symbols, arguably intensifying an already fraught geopolitical relationship and making compromise harder to achieve.
Okay, those examples help illustrate how religion can be mobilized to escalate things. So, stepping back again, what does this all mean for policymakers? It's clearly not about saying religion inherently causes conflict.
No, definitely not.
But it's something much more intricate about how it gets used politically, especially once trouble starts.
Exactly. Hennon concludes it's really about how leaders draw on ideologies like religion in response to domestic sentiment that exacerbates international conflict. The crucial insight for policymakers, he suggests, is that they should focus their attention not on trying to suppress religious expression itself, which can often backfire,
Right, that can create more extremism.
but rather on addressing the pathological, institutional, and political conditions that often repress and radicalize religious sentiment. Things like authoritarianism, lack of political inclusion, systematic discrimination against religious groups. These are the underlying factors that can weaponize religious differences, turning religion into a powerful force that intensifies disputes once they have already begun due to other factors.
So it's about the political context in which religion operates. Good governance, inclusivity, respect for rights, those might be the best antidotes to religion being used to fuel conflict severity.
That seems to be the implication. Understanding these dynamics means looking beyond just the religious label to the underlying governance structures and the political pressures leaders face, both domestically and internationally.
Okay, fascinating stuff. Let's turn our attention now to one of the most visible and often heart-wrenching consequences of conflict, but also, as the research suggests, potentially a driver of further instability: refugees and forced migration.
Yeah, this is a huge issue globally, and it's a common observation, isn't it, that civil wars don't usually happen in neat, contained boxes. We often see what researchers call spatial clustering. Certain regions just consistently seem to experience more conflict than others. Think of West Africa over the years, or the Caucasus, the Balkans, the Great Lakes region of Africa.
That's right, conflict hotspots that seem to persist. And while we observe empirically that a civil war breaking out in one country often increases the statistical likelihood of conflict erupting in its neighbor.
The contagion effect.
The contagion effect, exactly. But the precise mechanisms for this spread, how that contagion actually happens beyond simple geographical proximity, have long been a bit of a puzzle for researchers.
It's hard to pin down exactly how the instability travels across the border.
It is. But some key research, specifically a 2007 study by Salehian and Gleditsch, offers a major explanatory mechanism that really tries to connect the dots between a humanitarian crisis in one country and the potential for instability in its neighbors.
Okay, what's their core insight?
Their key argument is that population movements, specifically refugee flows resulting from conflict, are an important mechanism by which conflict spreads across regions. They argue that refugees are not simply a passive consequence of conflict. Their very presence in a host country can actively increase the risk of future conflict breaking out there.
So refugees aren't just victims, but their presence can inadvertently contribute to new problems. How?
They outline two main pathways for this conflict diffusion. First, refugee flows can lead to the expansion of rebel social networks across borders.
Okay, break that down. How does that work?
Well, when people flee their homes due to violence, they often maintain strong ties, family ties, political ties, ethnic ties to their homelands. Refugees can sometimes continue to play active roles in the conflicts they fled, physically extending rebel networks and operations across international borders simply through their mobility and communication.
So the conflict literally crosses the border with the people.
In a sense, yes. They can also establish new contacts with locals in their host countries, especially if they share similar ethnic identities or political grievances with groups there. This can deepen existing divisions within the host country or even create new ones, effectively importing aspects of the original conflict.
I see.
And crucially, refugee camps located near national boundaries often become, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes deliberately, sanctuaries, operational bases, and fertile recruitment grounds for rebel organizations. It gives them a relatively safe space outside the reach of their home government to regroup, rearm, and plan further actions.
And I imagine sometimes these refugee communities can start to develop their own political dynamics that impact the host country.
Absolutely. That's another aspect. Refugee communities can develop quite complex political structures while in exile. Sometimes they make demands on their host governments for resources, for political recognition, sometimes even challenging the host government's authority in certain areas. This can lead to internal tensions, even conflict, within the host state, between refugees and locals, or refugees and the government.
And the host government might try to crack down?
Exactly. Host countries might actively try to control or cut off these transnational rebel networks operating from their territory, perhaps under pressure from the refugees' home country. And that attempt at control can itself spark conflict between the refugees and their hosts.
Can you give some examples of refugees being actively involved in conflict beyond their home borders?
The research points to several historical instances. For example, elements within the Tamil refugee community in India were implicated in the assassination of India's Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1991, reportedly due to his government's changing stance on the conflict in Sri Lanka. In another case, Tutsi refugees who had fled Rwanda and Burundi to Uganda played a significant role in the rebel movement that eventually helped overthrow the Obote government in Uganda in the 1980s. So their presence and continued political military involvement abroad can have profound destabilizing effects on the stability of their host nations.
Okay, so that's the first pathway, the physical extension and enabling of rebel networks and activities. What's the second main pathway Selhine and Gleditsch identify? It involves negative externalities, right? Unintended consequences for the receiving areas.
That's right. These are the broader impacts the refugee presence can have on the host society, even if the refugees themselves aren't directly involved in fighting. These externalities manifest in several key ways. Firstly, there's demographic change.
How does that cause problems?
Large, sudden refugee inflows can significantly alter the ethnic or religious composition of a particular region within the host state. This can ignite anxiety and resentment among the local population, sometimes fueling what researchers call nativist sentiment or sons of the soil movements. Locals feeling their identity, status, or resources are threatened by the newcomers.
It's not necessarily ancient hatreds, but perceived competition.
Exactly. It's often framed as a perceived threat to the local group's social status, cultural identity, political power, or access to resources, rather than some kind of primordial animosity. For example, Selhine and Gleditsch point to long-running conflicts in parts of northeastern India, like Assam, which were significantly fueled by the influx of Bengali migrants and refugees from neighboring Bangladesh over decades. These newcomers were often perceived by indigenous groups as displacing them politically and economically, sparking intense resentment and violence.
That makes sense. Any other examples?
A starker, more recent example they discuss is the impact on the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, following the Rwandan genocide in 1994. The mass exodus of hundreds of thousands of Rwandan Hutus, including many perpetrators of the genocide, into eastern Congo.
Fearing retribution from the Tutsi-led RPF.
Precisely. This massive influx sparked outrage among local Congolese Tutsi populations and other groups who felt threatened. It also mobilized opposition to the then-ruler Mobutu Sese Seko, who was seen as tolerating or even supporting the Hutu militias. This dynamic was a major factor in fueling the subsequent devastating wars in the Congo, which drew in multiple neighboring countries. The refugee flow dramatically altered the local political and ethnic landscape with catastrophic results.
Wow. Okay, so demographic shifts are one major externality. What else?
The second crucial aspect is economic competition. This is often a very immediate and visceral concern for host communities, especially in poorer regions.
Competition for jobs, resources.
Exactly. Refugees, often desperate for work, inevitably compete with local populations for scarce resources like employment, housing, arable land, even water. This influx of labor can depress wages in certain sectors, potentially raise prices for basic goods and rent, and lead to a perception, rightly or wrongly, of a general decline in living standards for the local populace. This can create widespread dissatisfaction and social tension that can, under certain conditions, invite violence or civil unrest.
Can you give an example of that economic tension?
They mentioned the situation in Macedonia, now North Macedonia, back in 1999 during the Kosovo crisis. Macedonia, a relatively small and not very wealthy country with its own existing ethnic tensions between Slavs and Albanians, suddenly had to host over 250,000 Kosovar Albanian refugees, a huge number relative to its population of about 2 million.
A massive burden.
Huge. And there was a widespread perception among the Macedonian Slav population that these refugees were responsible for declining economic conditions and were straining public services. This significantly exacerbated the pre-existing ethnic tensions in the country, bringing it close to its own civil conflict shortly after.
Okay. And is there a third factor in these externalities?
Yes. The third factor is more direct: the potential for the direct importation of the conflict itself. Refugees can sometimes bring combatants, weapons, and ideologies conducive to violence directly with them across the border, further destabilizing the host country simply by transplanting the conflict dynamics.
So it's a multi-pronged risk. Networks, demographic shifts, economic strain, and direct importation. Does the research back this up with strong empirical evidence? They looked at data spanning half a century, right? 1951 to 2001?
They did, yes, and their statistical analysis produced some very strong findings. The presence of refugees originating from neighboring countries experiencing conflict was found to have a significant positive effect on the probability of civil war breaking out in the host country.
So refugees from next door significantly raise the risk.
Yes, and importantly, distance mattered. Refugees arriving from distant countries, say, from a different continent, did not have a statistically significant impact on conflict risk in the host country. This really reinforces the idea that it's a local, regional diffusion mechanism, likely tied to those network extensions and local externalities we discussed.
Okay, that makes sense. Did they try to quantify the risk? How much does the risk increase?
They did attempt to estimate the magnitude. They found that a substantial increase in refugees from neighboring states, their example was an increase of about 100,000, was associated with a 57% increase in the predicted probability of conflict onset in the host country in the following year.
Wow, over 50% increase.
Yeah, and that risk nearly doubled, increasing by about 114% if there was also an active civil war ongoing in a neighboring country at the same time. It shows a compounding effect between refugee flows and existing regional instability.
That's a huge multiplier. Can you give us that concrete example again, the DRC case? How did the model play out there?
Right, the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1996 provides a really compelling case study from their analysis. At that specific time, the DRC, then Zaire, was hosting over 670,000 refugees from its conflict-ridden neighbors like Rwanda and Burundi. Their statistical model predicted about a 12% chance of a civil conflict breaking out in the DRC in the next year without those refugees being present.
Okay, 12% baseline risk.
But with those 670,000 refugees factored in, the model's predicted probability jumped to 20%. That's a very large relative increase, almost doubling the risk directly attributable, according to their model, to the destabilizing presence of those large refugee populations from neighboring conflicts. And sadly, as we know, conflict did indeed engulf the DRC shortly thereafter.
So this isn't just an academic finding. It translates into potentially catastrophic real-world probabilities. But this leads to a really important question. What does this all mean for policymakers? Especially when we consider that the overwhelming vast majority of refugees are simply innocent people fleeing horrific violence. They are victims, not perpetrators. It sounds like a dangerous finding if misinterpreted.
That is absolutely crucial context, and the researchers themselves are very careful to emphasize this. It is not a deterministic link. Most refugee flows, the vast majority, do not lead to violence in the host country. And most refugees are victims seeking safety, not combatants seeking to spread war. There is no inherent, automatic, deterministic link between refugees and conflict. That would be a dangerous and inaccurate conclusion.
So it's about risk factors, not inevitability.
Exactly. It's about identifying potential risk factors that need to be managed proactively. And importantly, the research also highlights that effective policy can make a huge difference. They point to the positive success story of Malawi during the 1980s and early 1990s.
What happened in Malawi?
Well, Malawi, despite being one of the world's poorest countries at the time, received nearly 2 million refugees fleeing the brutal civil war in neighboring Mozambique. That was equivalent to about 10% of Malawi's entire population, an enormous influx.
An incredible burden for such a poor country. How did they cope?
Malawi's response, which Salahin and Gletsch describe as heroic, involved extensive local integration efforts. They provided refugees with access to land, allowed them opportunities for employment, and cooperated extensively with the UNHCR and other aid agencies. This proactive, humane, and integration-focused approach, they argue, largely prevented the spread of conflict from Mozambique into Malawi, despite the massive refugee presence and the potential risks.
So it demonstrates that the outcome isn't predetermined. Policy choices matter hugely.
Hugely. It shows that how host countries and the international community manage refugee flows is critical.
So the takeaway for policymakers isn't close the borders or view refugees as a threat. It's something much more constructive.
Exactly. The implication isn't restrictionism. Rather, policymakers should focus on generously managing the humanitarian needs of migrants and refugees, while also actively identifying and addressing potential security risks within refugee communities, things like preventing rebel recruitment or managing intergroup tensions. And crucially, tackling the root causes of flight in the sending countries is paramount in the long run.
So support for refugees and good governance can actually be security policies.
Precisely. Generous asylum programs, policies that promote integration or at least peaceful coexistence, and effective, fair governance of refugee communities, rather than neglect or overly securitized punitive approaches, can actually mitigate the risks identified in the research and prevent conflict escalation. It's a complex challenge, no doubt, but one where the evidence suggests that compassion and effective management are not only morally right, but also strategically smart for maintaining regional stability. Hashtag outro.
Wow, what an incredible deep dive today. We've certainly covered a lot of ground and seen some truly unexpected connections emerge, haven't we? Really challenging some of our ingrained assumptions about what drives global conflict.
We really have. It forces you to connect dots you might not normally connect.
Absolutely. We started by essentially redefining what a rogue state really means, moving beyond just missiles and terrorism to focus intensely on how a state treats its own people, and find that internal repression, that pattern of human rights abuse, is actually a remarkably powerful predictor of external belligerence.
Yeah, that linkage between internal and external behavior was striking. And then we peeled back the layers on civil wars, revealing those deep-seated ethnic dynamics that so often fuel them, starting with grievances born of discrimination.
The motive.
Then the unique mobilization advantages ethnic groups often possess, the opportunity,
A means.
and finally, those profound, difficult challenges of bargaining failure, especially commitment problems tied to identity, that make lasting peace so tragically elusive in those contexts.
And we also explored the really nuanced role of culture in national security, recognizing it not as some kind of silver bullet replacement for realism's focus on power,
Definitely not a replacement.
but as a vital lens, a crucial supplement for understanding the how and why of state behavior, especially when material forces alone seem indeterminate or leave puzzles unexplained.
Right, filling in those gaps, explaining the variations. Then we turn to religion, uncovering its surprising influence not so much on whether conflicts start, but on how severe they become once they do, particularly when you have those close religion-state institutional ties and that significant ideological distance between adversaries.
The severity, not the onset. That was key. And finally, we traced that profound, often unseen ripple effect of human migration, seeing how refugee movements, while primarily a humanitarian crisis affecting victims,
Primarily victims, yes.
can also, under certain conditions and if poorly managed, become a significant quantifiable mechanism for spreading instability and conflict across borders through network expansion and negative externalities.
Yeah. And I think what ties all of these different insights together, really, is the fundamental understanding that to truly grasp global conflict, we absolutely need to look beyond the immediate headlines, beyond the surface events.
Dig deeper.
Dig deeper. It means recognizing that internal dynamics, how states treat their citizens, ethnic relations, domestic political structures, and ideational factors like cultural beliefs or religious mobilization, and even human movement itself. These are not separate, isolated factors siloed off from international relations. They are deeply, inextricably intertwined with how states behave towards each other.
It's all connected.
It really is. It's about seeing violence not just as discrete physical acts, but also as embedded in structures, social structures, political institutions, international norms, and how those structures shape behavior both internally and externally.
So, thinking about all these connections we've unpacked today, here's a final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to maybe mull over. If the way a state treats its own citizens, its record on ethnic discrimination, gender equality, political repression, is actually a stronger predictor of its international belligerence than its pursuit of banned weapons. And if how we collectively manage humanitarian crises like refugee flows abroad can directly influence peace and stability in neighboring nations, potentially preventing the spread of war, then what fundamental shifts in our global priorities, our foreign policies, maybe even our resource allocation might be necessary to truly foster international security in the coming decades?
That's a powerful question. It really invites us to rethink not just our strategies and policies, but perhaps our very understanding of what creates security, what creates stability in this incredibly complex, interconnected world we live in. We really encourage you to reflect on these interconnections we've discussed and maybe see how your own understanding of global events might now be enriched, perhaps spotting some of those patterns that link the internal lives of states to their external actions and link human suffering to broader regional stability.